I would say this to everybody who's watching this. This economic crisis is like a cancer. If you just wait and wait thinking this is going to go away, just like a cancer, it's going to grow and it's going to be too late. What I would say to everybody is get prepared. This is not a time right now to wishful thinking the government is going to sort things out. The governments don't rule the world. Goldman Sachs rules the world. Goldman Sachs rules the world.
Former Reagan budget director, David Stockman. All right, 2 points to make with you, David. First of all, you've said many times, and you wrote a book about it, that when the Fed stops printing money, we will have a real problem with the stock market. Yeah, I think you used the word crash.
Summer looks okay so far, but storm clouds on the horizon, a possible crash brewing, and it might actually even be worse than 2008. We've got the man who actually called the 2008 crash, and he's the author of The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcies, Peter Schiff, here to tell us how this looks. Peter, in 2008, we had stocks collapse 60%. We saw banks going out of business. We saw unemployment spike. It was pretty ugly. You think this is going to be worse? How's it going to be worse? What's this look like?
Well, it's going to be a lot worse.
There is a terrible currency problem. We're on the verge of a currency war. The Federal Reserve is printing dollars like there's no tomorrow, and if they keep going, the rest of the world is not going to accept them.
So people still don't want to believe that the worst is yet to come.
It's easy to think of these predictions as much too gloomy, but that is exactly what people said the last time, when these experts predicted the 2008 financial crisis. They were laughed at in the media.
You guys are deluding yourself.
When we last spoke last January, you weren't very optimistic about the global economy. What would you say about the state of the economy now?
This system is in collapse, and it's unbelievable, and most people don't even see what's going on.
So what are the top things that are grabbing your attention right now?
Mostly, it's how the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve are reacting to all the problems. We're in the last days of this financial system in the U.S. This is Zimbabwe. This ship is going down. This is the USSR in 1989.
Well, lots of people wouldn't believe you. They'd say, you know what, you're out in left field. You're nuts.
It is a pleasure to have back on with us world-famous adventurer, entrepreneur, investor, and writer, Jeff Berwick. This may be our most important show yet, so let's get right into this, as you're not going to want to miss what Jeff Berwick has to say today. And, Jeff, you've never been shy about telling people your opinions, but your latest pronouncement may be your boldest yet.
Yeah, it is, but I really think now is the time to be bold. I found that most people don't know about this information, and I think it needs to be shown the light of day. I guess I should start by saying that I've never made such an exact short-term prediction, but when people see the evidence I've uncovered, they'll understand why I believe a massive event could happen as early as this September.
Give us some background on how you came to this conclusion.
Well, it started out quite simply. In 2010, I stated that the US dollar would collapse within the next decade. To me, the path was quite clear. You just look at the total debt of the US government, now at $18 trillion, and its growth, and you can see where this is headed. And when you look further, you can see that even with a monstrous $18 trillion debt, it was only a small part of the story, as so much of the debt and liabilities of the US aren't properly accounted for. Today, the amount of debt and liabilities of the US government is over $95 trillion. That's $300,000 per person in the US, or $1.2 million in federal government debt and liabilities for every family of four. I'm sure you remember the Great Recession or the financial crisis of 2008. It was very bad. And even George Soros was quoted on it as saying, "We witnessed the collapse of the financial system in 2008. And all they've done, and all they're still doing, is print money to act like it didn't die." But the proof is in the numbers. In 2008, the Federal Reserve announced something they had never done before. They called it quantitative easing. But what it really is printing never-before-seen amounts of money. That money's been sloshing around and has mostly ended up in places like the stock market, which, even as we speak, continues to hit all-time highs. At some point, though, this money printing game has to stop, and the rest of the world knows this is a certainty. And in response, countries around the world have begun to move away from the dollar. China's begun their own bank transfer system, which is the first international payment system to compete with the US dollar-based SWIFT system. There's a worldwide move away from the dollar. They're trying to rush it out to be completed by, of all dates, September 2015. Russia as well has been purchasing gold at record levels, and trade agreements around the world are for the first time in decades being done outside of the US dollar. For this and many other reasons, I've been expecting a collapse in the dollar. It's baked in the cake, and I've been telling my subscribers to prepare for this since 2010. Back in 2010, I said that we probably had 5 and no more than 10 years left before the collapse. We're now 5 years in, and I'm seeing the first signs of a major collapse coming this fall, and part of my reason for this has come with my discovery of the Shemitah.
Right, this is the part I want to get into. I've heard you speak and write on it recently. It sounds fascinating. Take as long as you want here and just tell us more about the Shemitah.
Sure. Regarding Shemitah, I want to state for the record that my discovery of it has emerged as part of my financial analysis. The Shemitah has religious connotation, but that's not my focus. The point is that there are evidence-based ramifications to Shemitah, and from a practical standpoint, that's what I wish to investigate and address. I'm just looking at the facts of what appears to be happening around September of this year, and that just happens to be the end of the Shemitah year. Whether this is a coincidence or not remains to be seen. And I should also say that I don't necessarily think this September will be the end crisis of all crises. It could be just the beginning of a process that unfolds that takes many years to end in total collapse. But that said, I first heard of the Shemitah after reading Jonathan Cahn's book, The Harbinger. That book mostly talked about eerie events related to 9/11 and the Shemitah. While I found all the events related to 9/11 to be incredibly interesting, the thing that really got my interest was in what he said about the Shemitah. Now, as background, the Shemitah is the Sabbath year, and it's the 7th year of the 7-year agricultural cycle mandated by the Torah for the land of Israel, and it's still observed in contemporary Judaism. To put it simply, every 7 years is a Shemitah year. Because it is based on the Hebrew calendar, it doesn't fall on the same dates every year as our Western calendar, but it does follow quite closely. The Shemitah is also known as a time where all debts are settled, every 7 years. It also can be interpreted as the washing away of things. But what caught my attention was that the last day of the Shemitah for the last 2 Shemitahs in 2001 and 2008 fell on days with a major market collapse. The last day of Shemitah in 2001 fell on September 17th, and that was the first day the US stock markets opened after 9/11. That day had the greatest one-day stock market point crash in US history up to that time. The Dow fell almost 700 points, or 7%, and it was a record that held for precisely 7 years until the end of the next Shemitah year. That year was 2008. On September 29, 2008, the exact final day of the Shemitah, the Dow plummeted 777 points, which still today remains the greatest one-day stock market crash of all time. You may be noticing quite a few sevens in all of this. As well, on that day, it was the only known day on the New York Stock Exchange where the opening bell wouldn't ring.
You're watching CNBC's Squawk on the Street, where the opening bell should have rung 5 seconds ago, but has not. I don't know whether we actually need the bell to start trading.
Hold on. There is a little bit of a consternation down here about there being no bell. All right. Our market reporters are standing by. Bob Pisani, have you ever seen anything like no bell?
Yeah, that's a little strange here. But
I then decided to go back to Shemitah years since 1900, and I was very surprised at what I found. 1917 was a Shemitah year. 1917 marked the year that the US entered into World War I, and soon after, the Russian, German, Austrian, and Turkish empires had collapsed. Remember, the Shemitah is a time of washing away. 1930-1931 was a Shemitah year, and certainly wasn't a good time to be in the markets. From the beginning of the Shemitah year until the end of the Shemitah, the market dropped 50% from 200 to 100, and then after the final day of the Shemitah, the market dropped another 50% to below 50. Now, the next major Shemitah was in 1937 to 1938, and if you were in the market that year, you'd have lost nearly 50%. But more importantly than the stock market during that Shemitah year was what was going on in the world. During the Shemitah year in 1938, Germany began foreign aggression and seized Austria and Czechoslovakia. The World War that began in 1938 finally ended in September of 1945, nearly on the exact same day as the final day of the Shemitah. Countless empires and countries were left devastated by that date, again a washing away, if you will. The next Shemitah was in 1973. In 1973, the Bretton Woods worldwide monetary system collapsed. The following Shemitah was in 1980, seen by most gold bugs and market historians as marking the end of the massively inflationary 1970s. Then the next Shemitah year ended in 1987. During that time, Black Monday occurred, the biggest one-day percentage drop in history on the Dow. That same week, the London stock market closed due to an extremely rare hurricane having hit London. Again, a sort of washing away. During the next Shemitah, the 1994 bond market massacre caused financial strife worldwide. And I've already mentioned the incredibly bizarre things that happened during the next two Shemitahs in 2001 and 2008. Of course, you can say that if you look for patterns, you can always find them in one way or another, and to an extent that's true. But this Shemitah 7-year cycle is so eerily correct that it is well known on Wall Street as the 7-year cycle. For this reason, I've been keeping an eye on the end of the next Shemitah year on September 13th, 2015. And because of this, I began doing some research on what events may be happening in or around that time. And the amount of bizarre things scheduled for this coming September is what convinced me something is being planned for this fall.
Yes. Everything you've covered so far is the past. Let's talk about the present and near future.
Well, I decided to begin looking up the days on or around September 13th of this year to see if I could find any interesting events, and it didn't take long before I found numerous events, all happening on or around that date of major significance. The first thing I found was that the United Nations opens its 70th session of the UN General Assembly on September 15th in New York City. World leaders from around the world will be attending. They call it their Jubilee session. Now, I didn't mention this yet, but every 7th Shemitah, or in other words, every 7th 7-year period, or after every 49 years, is called the Jubilee year, every 50 years. In the Jubilee, according to Jewish religion, it is the year when God, supposedly, gives back land taken away from their ancestors to them. Of note, in the last Jubilee, in 1967, Israel won the 7-Day War when Israel defeated Jordan and captured the West Bank, defeated Egypt and captured the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula, and defeated Syria and captured the Golan Heights. Looking even further back to the prior Jubilee year in 1918, the British Empire took back Jerusalem from the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And so in both prior Jubilee years, there was a major development in Israel. The next Jubilee year starts on September 14th of this year. As well, in September, the UN plans to launch a new plan for managing the entire globe called the Sustainable Development Summit from September 25th to 27th. Some of the biggest names on the planet, including Pope Francis, will be speaking at this summit. The focus of this plan is to expand the scope of global governance. Global governance can also be defined as one world government or a new world order. The Pope, interestingly enough, will be busy in the US all of September, as on September 15th, the Pope will also be speaking at the UN, and then on September 24th, he'll also be speaking at the US Congress. The next thing I notice is that JAde Helm, a massive, unprecedented rollout of the US military inside of the US, runs from July 15th until September 15th. This is particularly interesting in that there always seems to be a drill being run by the government during when an actual crisis occurs. JAde Helm has already begun in preparations, and the amount of military equipment being amassed in the US is truly mind-boggling. There's a lot of speculation that this amount of military buildup in the American South is in preparation for some sort of civil unrest. That speculation built when a number of Walmart stores recently closed on the same day across the southern US with no notice due to plumbing problems and are said to remain closed for 6 months. This fueled speculation that it's to be used for some sort of detention center for unrest. They said they wouldn't reopen for 6 months, which just happens to be after September. But it gets stranger and stranger. Recently, the New York-based Federal Reserve announced it's moving its operations outside of New York to Chicago because of concerns about a natural disaster. One might ask, what natural disaster are they expecting in New York that they aren't expecting in Chicago? Then, after the Fed's recent Federal Open Market Committee meeting, It took the highly unusual act of removing all calendar references from its post-meeting statement. Normally, in the post-meeting statement, they include calendar events for upcoming important dates like the next meeting. This time they didn't, and they just alluded that a date range for their long-awaited 0.25% rate hike, which alone can almost teeter the entire financial and monetary system loaded with debt, would likely be in the fall. But while they didn't put any dates of future meetings in their post-meeting notes, they do have dates on their website of upcoming meetings. According to their site, the next meeting will be held just after the Shemitah on September 16th and 17th. Meanwhile, the U.S. federal government is buying another 62 million rounds of ammunition commonly used in AR-15s for training purposes, and NORAD announced that it is moving back into the Cheyenne Mountains because it is EMP hardened, leaving one to ask why NORAD is moving into the mountains to protect against a major attack at this time.
It certainly appears as though a lot is happening, all surrounding this September.
Absolutely, and the list of strangeness goes on and on. There was the strange 7-minute speech by Christine Lagarde of the IMF talking about numerology and the number 7 that she made in January of last year. She started the speech by saying, "As you can tell, I do what I'm told." And she went on to say, "I want to test your numerology skills on the magic number 7. Most of you know that is quite a number."
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. As you can tell, I do as I'm told. Numerology skills, by asking you to think about the magic 7. Okay? Most of you will know that 7 is quite a number in all sorts of themes, religions.
That's a strange speech about numerology and the number 7 coming from the managing director of the IMF. There was also French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, who made a bizarre speech in 2014, stating that we are on the edge of a climatic abyss.
We are, all of you know it, on the edge of a climatic abyss. In fact, we have 500 days to avoid a climate chaos.
Out of curiosity, I added up the days from that speech, and 500 days from it lands on September 23rd, 2015. Yet no one questioned him why 500 days exactly. You can find many more examples like this. Everything seems to be gravitating towards this September. Something's going on. What that is anyone's guess.
You want to take a guess?
There's too many variables to make a solid guess, but this is far too many coincidences that all seem to point to something massive happening around September of this year. Also, there's Martin Armstrong, who was jailed for having a computer model that amazingly predicts the fall of currencies, markets, and even nations, predicted 20 years ago that there will be a massive system reset, collapse, or crisis on October 1st, 2015. If you listen to the actions of the Fed, they seem to be worried about some sort of natural disaster to happen in the New York area. If you listen to NATO, they appear to be preparing for an EMP attack. If you pay attention to the US military, they are apparently preparing for a massive amount of unrest inside the US. And if you pay attention to the UN, September seems to be a very busy month with leaders from around the world, including the Pope, attending numerous major events. In fact, we've already seen the first rumblings of a coming collapse happening in both Greece and China. The Shanghai stock market has already begun to collapse, falling more than 30% in the last 2 months, and the Chinese Nasdaq fell 40% in the last 3 weeks. And in Greece, the banks and stock market have been closed for weeks, and they're laying the foundation for a civil chaos that I expect to fully foment over the summer and explode in September. This will set off a chain reaction that will shake the entire US dollar-based financial system.